All right. I would like to start by thanking Professor Bedino for putting this whole thing together. So if we could get a round of applause. All right. My name is Greg Wright. I will be the moderator for the presentation/questions afterwards. These are your fine panelists. These are all English honors students, and they're here to present you with some of the, some of the lessons they've learned through research about some of the various things that humans are doing to shape our environment that also have positive or negative impacts on the environment. We've got some problems, some solutions, and some ideas. So first up, we have Matt. He will be going over climate change and capitalism and the climate controversy. So.
You guys like the alliteration there? I spent a lot of time coming up with that. No, I didn't. Slideshow. Guys, how do I? Here we go. Okay. I'm just going to grab these. Sure thing. So, capitalism and the climate controversy. So I'm going to start my presentation by establishing the base level of information that you need to understand that climate change is happening. There's a boatload of scientific data, whether you want to look at glaciers melting all over the world, or sea levels rising, or global temperature rising. Climate change is happening. And then climate change is going to have catastrophic effects on America and the world. You can already see some of this happening with droughts in California, which NASA says would require 11 trillion gallons of water to make up for the water deficit that we're experiencing, which is also going to carry over into crop shortages because we get most of our vegetables, fruits, and nuts from California. Also, you have sea level rising occurring. You have places such as Norfolk, Virginia, New Orleans, and Miami literally sinking into the ocean with sea level has been increasing 0.14 inches a year, and that's increasing in speed as time goes on. And so if climate change is happening, we have all the scientific data, and these and the effects are going to be really bad. Why then do so many people not believe in it? Well, there's a concentrated effort by powerful individuals in America to spread misinformation about climate change and its effects. And that's because there are some powerful individuals that serve to make a lot of money off of the industries that cause climate change. So this some examples of think tanks and institutes. The Heartland Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and Citizens United are all think tanks that are devoted, conservative think tanks that are devoted to spreading information to serve the needs of those individuals who created them. The Heritage Institute, for example, their tagline is the world's most prominent think tank promoting skepticism about man-made climate change. And so this last name here, the Koch Brothers, are two of the most powerful individuals in America. They own Koch Industries, which is an oil, gas, and chemical conglomerate, which are the industries that are contributing the most to man-made climate change. They spent $20 million lobbying in 2008, and they are estimated to emit 24 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere a year. That's the same amount as 5 million cars. And so they are some of the people who are funding the climate change skeptics. And so throughout American history, the oil industry in general, but especially the oil industry, has been ingrained in American politics. And as a capitalist system, those money talks in America. The oil industry, the 5 top oil producers in America made over $9.3 billion in profit in 2013. ExxonMobil is number 2 on the Fortune 500 list of companies. And in America, oil companies get $21.6 billion in subsidies a year. And so what can we do about this? Well, throughout history, we've experienced other environmental disasters similar to climate change throughout history, and we have managed as a country to put forth solutions to solve this. And capitalism is nothing if not a incentive system for individuals. So if we want to solve the solution, we have to use capitalism in that way. One example is acid rain was a big problem in the 1990s, but we introduced the cap and trade system, which is a system where industries were allowed a certain limit to the amount of pollution they could put out, and then they could sell. If a company did not put out the CO2 or the SO2 rather, they could sell these for a profit. And so this used free market principles to solve an environmental problem by making it more expensive to pollute than not to. So the most important thing in solving the issue of climate change is to vote. That's the best thing that an individual can do, is to vote for people who believe in climate change. And here are the sources for my presentation. Okay.
That was great. Thank you. All right, next up we have Josh. He's going to be going over some industrial agriculture methods and practices for you, and he has the best named presentation, in my opinion, Reaping What We Sow. So everybody, please give it up for Josh.
Okay, so I'll make things quick since we don't have too much time, but is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, so my presentation is Industrial Agriculture, Reaping What We Sow. And to bring everybody up to speed, basically, what industrial agriculture is it's agriculture on a very, very large scale, sometimes called factory farming or intensive farming. Generally, it's very large land plots, hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands even. Commonly uses pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and other petrochemicals to grow their plants faster and to yield more fruits. It's also very water intensive and uses a lot of irrigation, obviously, for the plants. Oftentimes, they employ a monoculture farming technique, which is where just one crop is grown in mass. So this may be wheat or corn or soy. But it also includes CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. I'm sure everyone's seen those pictures of cows and pigs cramped together, chickens even. And it also includes fishing in agriculture, which is mostly intensive fishing, those giant nets that catch billions of fish. So why does industrial agriculture exist? Well, mostly because it's profitable. Companies make a lot of money. The companies listed there are the 6 biggest, and they're collectively worth several $100 billion. But industrial agriculture actually started in the 16th century. At that point in time, farmers learned that they can use compounds like arsenic, mercury, and lead to kill off a lot of the pests that were damaging their plants. They didn't know then how toxic that was for their food. But in the early 19th century, or mid-19th century, there was a big revolution in technologies, and DDT and other pesticides were introduced that were more effective and slightly safer. By the 1960s, herbicides became commonplace alongside with pesticides, and finally the EPA was established in 1970, a little bit too late. So industrial agriculture kind of already existed before we could do anything about it. But since the EPA's establishment in 1970, pesticide use has increased 50-fold in the United States alone, and even more internationally. So a question of sustainability has come up in recent times because industrial agriculture utilizes a lot of petroleum-based chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides. And we know that we have a finite number of these and we can't use them forever. So with a population increasing, possibly reaching 11 billion by 2050, which is a huge number, scientists wonder if we can even afford to feed the people by then if we'll run out of petrochemicals. But on top of that, the current farming techniques cause a lot of soil depletion, so that it's difficult to use the same plots of land repeatedly, and even after using them, the food is inferior quality to what it once was. Also, pests and weeds have developed a tolerance to pesticides and herbicides, and in animal feeding operations, the antibiotics used, the bugs are developing a tolerance to them as well. Not only that, but fisheries around the entire world, 75% of them already are at or exceeding maximum yield, which means that we can't fish them anymore. So with the growing population, where will we get the remaining fish from? Fish actually is a staple food for 1/3 of the entire world. It's their main source of protein in their diet. And then finally, obviously there's a high need for land in agriculture. It's predominantly land-based. You don't really build farms upwards, but they're starting. So now the environmental impacts are really coming to light now. It was not recorded or watched for several decades or even centuries. But now we see effects of chemical runoff from the pesticides and herbicides that farmers are using regularly. We even see the carbon footprint because they're using all these petrochemicals and they're shipping them, flying them on planes to employ pesticides. They're really racking up like a huge carbon footprint. On top of that, a lot of animals and their habitats are being destroyed very regularly. You can see in the picture here, we have what looks like killer sharks or killer whales. They're all dead. Also, as Matt pointed out, water depletion is a huge issue. So a lot of times clean water won't be available or lakes and rivers will dry up. But then on top of that, the carbon footprint melts glaciers, so ocean water rises, but it's not really usable. It's a salt water, which is very expensive to turn into clean water to use for plants. I'll also show you some of the land erosion that farmers see in their line of work, and it oftentimes renders large plots of land unusable. And then the sea pollution is obviously evident, and from fish farms, specifically like salmon, one salmon produces about 25 times as much waste by weight as a human, and a lot of times that waste is just left in like concentrated areas of the ocean where it kills off a lot of the natural life that's been present there. And then I'll show you a short clip, hopefully it plays, to kind of give you some imagery and a better understanding of what's actually going on here. Okay, so in the essence of time, I won't play the rest of the hour-long documentary. But basically, you can see firsthand how the soil is eroded to a point where it's unusable now to farmers. And what's happening is that you have a growing population, so you have more mouths to feed, and now you have less land to feed them with, which obviously raises an alarm for a lot of people, if you think about it. If you don't, then it's fine. So what should you do as consumers? Well, actually, you can do a lot more than you think. Many people do feel helpless in this, but you should buy certified food that's organic certified, that's eco-friendly, bee-friendly, and Food Alliance certified, and many more. Do your homework. Some are better than others, but all of them are better than nothing. And it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. On top of that, you can grow your own food in your own home garden. You can call it a victory garden because it is a victory in itself. And avoid excessive packaging on food products and anything else you buy. And when you do have to buy packaging, try to recycle it as best you can. Support environmentally friendly organizations and charities. This is your Charity Water or your Water Foundation, Trees for the Future, Plant a Billion. There's countless ones that are helping the world in their own way. And tell your friends. It never hurts. A lot of people our age really don't believe that climate change is an issue in any way. And it's a lot more believable coming from someone they trust already. rather than like, your teachers and textbooks who wants to listen to that. And you can always write to your representatives. Enough letters, and they'll realize that if they don't do something, they'll probably lose their place in office for somebody who will. So, every voice counts. Thank you.
All right, so next up we have Rebecca, who is going to go over some alternative energy solutions for all these problems we've been showing you guys. Also, while she's getting ready, I'm going to walk around and take your questions from you. So if you could pass those to the center of the aisle.
All right, hi everyone. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about hydrogen energy and why it's important to really invest in it. So as Matt and Josh said in their presentations, the climate is changing, and it's changing at a rapid pace, more than it has been in history, and it's really not getting any better. And so I'm going to show you a little bit, just a map of different states and what they believe about climate change. Okay, so this is just, Yale did a study last year, and it shows what percentage of the population in each state supports that global warming is happening. And as you can see, a lot of them are in 60s, 70s, so that's pretty good. But when you go to that global warming is already harming people in the U.S., it changes, and not a lot of people believe that. But then when you click on how many people believe global warming will harm people, it changes, and then it'll harm people in the future, like future generations. It changes a lot. So you can see, people may not believe it's happening right now, but they believe that it's going to change in the future, the near future. And policy support, the percentage of people that believe that we should fund research into renewable energy sources, that's a lot. And so you can see, people support it, but nothing's really being done about it. And so it's really important to kind of put more emphasis on it than we have been in the past. And this just shows if we should regulate CO2 as a pollutant. A lot of people, again, 70s, 80s, they believe that we should, but again, nothing's being done about it. So. And so I'm just going to give you a little history of it. The first hydrogen fuel cell was invented in 1839 by Sir William Grove, and he basically knew that hydrogen and oxygen can be separated from putting water in something by an electric current, and he thought that by reversing that, he would be able to create electricity, and he was right. And so in 2003, during President Bush's State of the Union address, he introduced the Hydrogen Fuel Initiative, which really he wanted to emphasize the importance of investing in alternative fuel sources, especially hydrogen. And then the legislation supported that by instilling the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the Advanced Energy Initiative of 2006. And really the main goal of that was to develop hydrogen fuel cell technology that was practical and affordable and that could be used by the year of 2020. And I'm going to explain to you now how fuel cells work as best I can. It's a little confusing, so bear with me. Basically, hydrogen atoms have positive charges and oxygen atoms have negative charges, and when you put them through an anode and a cathode, the charges are stripped into separate atoms, and then the charges, the hydrogen gets converted into electricity, and then it goes over to the cathode side and creates water. So basically, no pollution. And hydrogen-powered cars, it used to be just like a thought of the future, you know. No one really ever thought that it would be possible and safe. But Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai all have researched it, and they've actually created affordable ways, well, kind of affordable, not for me, but for other people, for that. So I'm just going to show you the one Toyota has invented. Oh, wow. This is actually coming out later this year, so that's pretty cool. And the word they named it translates to future. So basically you can see you see that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can see that here is where the hydrogen fuel gets stored. Oh, wait, sorry. All right, so it basically takes air in right there, as you can see where it's moving. And it basically, the fuel and the oxygen from the air gets converted, and it goes into the fuel cell where it's powers the battery, basically. And then it's basically just like electric, so it moves the car. Pretty awesome. The problem with that is, yeah, the price, but you have to find stations that have hydrogen fuel. And so a lot of, I mean, it's going out in a test market in California, but I mean, if people really invest in it and open up more hydrogen fueling stations, it could be a really great way to reduce the pollution from cars. Have you all heard of the hydrogen house? No? No? Okay, well, that's good because I'm going to tell you about it. It basically, the guy who invented it, Mike Stritsky, he doesn't pay for any of his utilities because he uses hydrogen solar power to just like use everything, and he actually makes money off of it because it creates so much electricity that he can't possibly use it all, so he sells it back to the electric companies. Okay, so that just basically explained what the hydrogen house is. It's really awesome, and if we use that technology to power like schools, malls, any kind of buildings, it would really make a huge impact. So that's something that our local governments and our government nationally really needs to focus on starting. And some of the cons, I mean, it's really difficult to compress hydrogen into fuel, and it's expensive. They use platinum to do it. If any of you have ever tried buying platinum, it's really expensive. So scientists have actually recently found, I think it was just last year, they found a new way to convert it. Instead of using platinum, they use an iron-based catalyst and cobalt and nickel as well. So that's a solution to that. And that also brings the price down drastically, making it more affordable and practical for people like you and me to use. The accessibility of it, I mean, if we were to start, improving and expanding the hydrogen car market, we need the fueling stations to go with it. And so it's really important for first local towns to help the cars in that area, and then as the local towns expand that, it can go regional and then national, and that'll really make a big impact on it. And if you want to learn more about any of this, you can go to these websites. It tells you, and I don't know, it was pretty easy to understand when I read it from the websites, but yeah, those are the websites you can go to. And I'm going to hand it back over to Greg now.
All right, before we get started with our last panelist, I am going to have another questionnaire come around. So this is the post-debate. Hold on to this. You can fill it out after all the questions are answered, and then we'll take them from you as you leave. This is kind of for feedback for us and an evaluation for ourselves. So if you filled out one of these, please fill out the one that's coming around now. Next up, we have Alberto. Excuse me.
All right, guys. So what I'm going to talk about is climate change and the responsibility of the individual. As many of you might know, we are currently living in the information age. And now what that means is that now more than ever, there is statistics and data to back up our concerns over climate change. Yet the problem still persists, both on an international and on an individual level. There's little done to educate the public and involve them. The key here being involvement. There's too much focus on convincing people that the problem exists and too little focus being done on what to do about it. What I plan to focus on is not whether or not the problem exists, because it does, rather not what we can do about it and why we are or aren't morally obligated to act. Now, climate change is a collective action problem. Now, what that means is that collective action problems are cases in which single acts, driving a car, for example, by themselves cause no harm. So, for example, if there is only one person driving a car in the entire world, obviously the CO2 emissions from that car would have no impact on the global environment. But obviously there are millions of cars driving, and that collective cumulative responsibility is on us. How should we feel about our role in climate change? Well, for starters, the World Health Organization estimates that 150,000 deaths annually occur per year during in direct correlation to climate change. Now, the interesting thing here is, like, if we look at this, if we look at this graph, we can see that there is a high percentage, these are deaths per million in the southern African area and in Indian areas. Now, the interesting thing here is, like, when I turn to the next slide, this is the areas in which the places responsible for the most amounts of emissions, and we can see it's directly in proportional to the amount of deaths that climate change causes. America, for example, has an average of 1 to 2 million deaths over the entire lifespan, over history of deaths, but is responsible for a large amount of pollution. Excuse me. In recent studies, the U.S. has been found to be responsible for around 20% of the world's emissions. This, of course, is on a national level, and the question of our personal emissions is a little more difficult, especially ethically, depending on what moral values you hold. Now, one of the biggest problems when it comes to convincing people of what actions we have to do on climate change is, do I, as an individual, have caused significant impact on the global environment? And is my carbon footprint going to cause an actual result in which that leads to millions of deaths of people, as we've seen in the previous slides? And here we can see that our current annual emissions of fossil fuels results in 37 gigatons of carbon emissions. And compare that to our personal carbon footprint, it's nearly negligible, which is what we think, but in reality isn't. Now here is just a breakdown of the different parts of what could happen, what is currently being used, and how much we have of a carbon budget in order to spend. In the case of emissions, it appears that it is unseen and negligible in terms of world emissions, as we saw with the 37 gigatons of carbon emissions. Interestingly, though, I was able to find two calculations, both a best and worst case scenario, when it comes to our personal responsibility as individuals. John Nolt calculates that an average American CO2 emissions over their entire lifespan will result in 1 to 2 deaths. And that's something to be of concern, because if my actions or that lack thereof result in the deaths of 1 to 2 people, that's something that we definitely have to change. Now, this is just the worst case scenario. Taking it from a best case scenario, another John Broome, on the other hand, he calculates that your total actions of the average American CO2 emissions results in the decreasing lifespan of about 6 months for the individual. Now spread this around for every individual in the world, and it results in 2 milliseconds less life for every individual. And now that seems like absolutely nothing. If my actions only result in 2 milliseconds less of your life or anyone else's life, then why do I have to act in order to change climate change if it's such a negligible result? Now here lies the problem. And I'm going to explain this to you by using an analogy that Jonathan Glover, philosopher, explained. Now imagine there's a village of 100 villagers. Now, and each of these villagers is eating a bowl of beans. And each bowl has 100 beans in it. A band of raiders is hungry and goes into the village and takes each individual's bowl of beans. That results in a village left without any food. So there are 100 raiders and there are 100 villagers, and each raider takes an individual's bowl of beans. Now, the raiders eat the food, go home. Now the next day, the raiders are hungry, but they feel bad about what they've done, because they're some morally ethical raiders. But one of the raiders decides, instead of taking 1 bowl from each person, let's instead take 1 bean from each person's bowl. What this results in, so what this means is that I would take 1 bowl from your 1 bean from your bowl, 1 bean from your bowl, so on and so on, until you go through the 100 individuals. Now what happens here is that the end result is the same. The entire village is left without food. But each individual raider doesn't feel responsible because they only took 1 bean from each individual villager. So you see where the problem is that the result is the same. And the same thing can be applied to our carbon emissions. Even though we're only affecting, at best, a 2 millisecond result on shortening someone's lifespan, it's still a significant difference. We're still contributing to the deaths of millions of people. And that is why there is a need to act, there's a moral obligation to act. Now, what are the solutions? Because, as I said before, it's obviously a problem, and I hope I've convinced you of that. But what is there that we can do? One of the biggest things we can do is work on a national level, especially concerning our politicians. So expand the use of renewable energy, such as my colleague mentioned, when it comes to nitrogen cells and those types of energy systems. Increase vehicle fuel efficiency, and so that includes hydrogen cars, electric cars, anything along the sorts of that. Place limits on the amount of carbon that polluters are allowed to emit, which is something we're currently working on, but have struggled to do consistently throughout history. And build a clean energy economy by investing in efficient energy technologies, which again is something that we need to do and are getting little headway of doing it in our current political system. And now, what are the individual solutions to these problems? Like I said before, being politically active is definitely an important solution, because if we show politicians that we only vote for people who support climate change, then they will therefore vote for climate change in the U.S. government. And because politicians don't really follow what they believe in, but what the people believe in. And if we collectively decide that climate change is an important issue and negate votes to people who aren't believers in climate change, then there will be change. There also has to be an international look on how we can solve climate change. Costa Rica is a great example. As a country, they have resulted in 100% of, they're now using 100% renewable energy. Now that's incredible. As a country, all of their energy is not used from coals or fossil fuels, they're using 100% renewable energy. And this has been going on for, I believe, 75 days straight since the beginning of 2015, which is the longest any country has gone using 100% renewable energy. And so these are some great results that countries are having, but it's incredibly difficult to correlate them to other countries because Costa Rica, for example, uses hydro dams as a big source of the renewable energy, and that isn't applicable to every single country. So we have to look at each country's individual footprint and how we can respond depending on the country's climate and depending on the country's people. The key here being the people and our responsibility to act for change. Another thing that we should do is changes in our homes, very simple things. And this will result in saving us money because, I mean, in the end, that's one of the biggest things that results in people to act. If you're going to save $70 a year, for example, just by changing your light bulbs, that's a video game you can buy. That's saving money for a new laptop. If you are going to insulate your home, that will save you energy, and it will make your bills be lower in an annual basis. And obviously reduce, reuse, and recycle. While our impact is very, very small, it is our collective impact that makes the big difference. Because it's a collective issue, it needs a collective response. We can't disempower ourselves and cease to be active. We have a moral obligation to have hope and not give up. We have to lead not only through our actions, but through our examples. Thank you very much.
All right. So I have picked out 5 from the questionnaire, and I think these are fantastic questions. A lot of people ask some similar questions, so I tried to get all of those in here. So hopefully, if it's not the exact question you asked, it will touch upon your question. The first one, I think that is the most important, is what is the biggest cause of climate change, right? So let's set the groundwork for everything everyone just did. The biggest cause of climate change normally is Earth itself and its geological forces, right? Everyone's familiar with plate tectonics. So when the continents move around, sometimes they collide, sometimes they separate. It does all kinds of things, right? So we know that there used to be a supercontinent. Now we have 7 continents, right? So as these things form, smash together, they create mountains. When they pull apart, they create oceans. And the whole time, they're releasing these different greenhouse gases that are normally trapped with either in the crust of the Earth or within the core of the Earth, right? So when 2 plates pull apart and water rushes to fill that, it's also bringing out sulfur dioxide, carbon, and other gases. The positioning of the continents will also have a lot to do with it. So say Pangaea, everyone's familiar with the original supercontinent, right? So if that's just hanging out around the equator, that's great for life around the equator. But if you get a massive continent that forms, say on the South Pole like it did during the Ordovician period, then you will get the chance for these ice sheets and glaciers to form. So we have Antarctica at the South Pole right now, right? It's collecting a lot of ice. It's doing things to the environment. Chemical changes are happening all around. The volcanoes can also release all of these greenhouse gases into the air as the crust separates and clashes together. We get all kinds of great things. An asteroid has hit the Earth. That will certainly cause the climate to change if an asteroid hits the Earth. Today, the biggest cause of climate change is human activity. 97% of climate scientists agree on that fact. 97% of scientists don't agree on anything. If I said the sky was blue, you might find 3 people in the room that disagree with me about the exact color of the sky. So I think that we get scientists at a 97% agreement rate is pretty astounding. Humans are using fossil fuels. Today we're digging up all the carbon that the Earth has stored as it clashes and collides, as plants die and get buried by rocks. Things decompose and ultimately get washed into rivers and buried in sediment at the bottom of the ocean. Carbon is locked in there. We're digging all that carbon up and we're burning it and we're putting it back into the air. It's usually sequestered and inert. There's a delicate balance, and humans are currently disrupting that balance. So that is the biggest cause of climate change today. So our next question is, let's see, is there any way to end the changes of the climate, or are we just able to slow the changes? Would any of you guys like to comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah. No, I'll just bring this to you.
I can only speak on behalf of agriculture because that's what I mainly researched. But one of the biggest causes of climate change involving agriculture is the removal of vegetation on the landscape, so that's deforestation or whatever. Because these plants actually pull carbon out of the air and put it in their own cells or in the soil in some way or another, effectively removing it. By promoting the growth of new forests and new vegetation, you can actually help expedite the process that Earth once went through that brought all the carbon out of the air and into the ground.
And does money have anything to do with it?
I mean, what doesn't money have to do with it?
Yeah. So if we're making money off pollution, then people are going to pollute. If you said if it's more expensive if it's more expensive to pollute, if we make it expensive to pollute, then people will stop polluting, is generally one of the incentive methods. To completely end climate change would take massive worldwide effort, infrastructure rebuilding, transportation really burns a lot of greenhouse gases. We're shipping things all over the world. Everyone drives everywhere. It's a huge economic / environmental / globalization debacle that a lot of smart people are trying to figure out, and a lot of rich people are trying to prevent from happening. So does anybody, this is a discussion, so if you, at any time you want to say something or have another question, please raise your hand. Anyone so far? All right. Yes, please.
So just to add one thing to that question, which is I know many of you who've taken my class have seen part of a film called Carbon Nation. And in that film, we learned that there is actually enough solar energy hitting the Earth to satisfy the globe's demand for energy. So it's a matter of harvesting that and putting it to work for us. And that entails everything that Greg just talked about, which is redoing infrastructure and making all that happen and working against the moneyed interests that are against moving in that direction. But the possibility is there, and we have seen the Earth recover and heal itself from other environmental problems that we have caused, such as the ozone hole. Many of you have heard about this. We put chemicals in the atmosphere that caused a thinning of the ozone layer, and we stopped using those chemicals. The world came together and agreed to stop using those chemicals, and the ozone hole is in the process of healing itself, and we predict that it will heal itself within the next few decades. So is it possible to end these things? Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Stander. Our next question is, how can deniers of climate change in the general population be convinced of its existence? And luckily, we have a professor on hand who is studying that very thing. So I'll let Dr. Bodino answer that one first.
Okay, so there's a book. It just came out. Okay. It's by George Marshall, and the title is Climate Change. Don't even think about it. That's his title. And then the subtext is how brain science is revealing how we think about climate change. All right, so there's denial. There's the idea that we look out, and how many have heard the weather reports, how wonderful it is? Isn't this a wonderful day? But that's weather. It's not climate. So naturally, we take the world into our senses, okay? And it makes sense to think, well, it's spring. Everything's okay. All right, so that's what we mean by denial. The perception of everyday experience is what we're likely to believe. Well, you would say, well, what about people that have experienced Sandy, or that have experienced the drought, or extreme weather, typhoons? How about them? Can we interview them and ask them if now do you believe? Believe it or not, according to George Marshall's research, no. He's saying that they would rather think about the resilience of the community and how much help they've received than dwell on the horror and forget about dwelling on the idea that it might happen again. Right. And then now we come to the issue of doubt. What's the difference between denial and doubt? The doubters are people that know the science but don't believe it. So they might be saying, for example, well, we've always had these changes, as Greg has explained. So, however, those have taken thousands of years, sometimes millions of years to happen. What's happening now, it's in decades. It's in decades. And I am speaking as someone who started to really become charged with this when I had grandchildren. I also have sons a little older than you guys who are going to experience this, and I will not be here. Your generation has to get involved. There's hope if we, as we were saying, if we have collective action. There's a lot of innovation possible if only we would get rid of these earlier ways that we've been used to using, like fossil fuels. As Dr. Stander said, we can turn to solar. The hydrogen house is really inspiring. And I believe in our power to innovate, and if we could just get the collective action that we need, the politicians to believe, sign petitions, get involved, belong to the Sierra Club, for example, join the environmental club here. So we should really celebrate what we've done about reducing our carbon footprint, and we've won so many awards. So I hope that, Susan, you'll say something about that. There's hope. There's hope. And I'll say the last thing that George Marshall talked about is the fact if we create certainty, we may also be creating hopelessness. So we don't, that's really, hopefully that's not happening here. There is hope, but it depends on your, not only your belief, but your willingness to take action.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything they want to add on to that?
I think one of the key issues is, like, where does the responsibility lie? Is it on the individual? Is it on the government? Is it on big corporations? And in truth, it's an incorporation of all those things. As Matt has said, the corporations is a big thing because they sort of run our government in many senses. But we have to understand that the Constitution says we the people. We collectively chose those governmental leaders to lead our government, and we can collectively choose to deny them the right to be in Congress. And I think if there is anyone that we have to convince, or that we have to at least change their perspective on climate change, it's politicians. Because I think it's completely irresponsible of them, first of all, if they represent us as people, to say that it doesn't exist. And it's also our responsibility to make those little actions, make those little changes in our lives that will affect on the bigger scale, as a collective unit, the climate.
Thank you. All right, next up, do you believe climate change is a threat to national security? This is actually a two-part question, and I think I'm somewhat qualified to answer a national security question. Yes, climate change is a threat to national security. The Pentagon, the United States Navy have both conducted research and both concluded that climate change is going to be one of the biggest factors that contribute to war in the future. As was mentioned in the agricultural slide, water sources are becoming very scarce. You'll definitely see some fighting over who has access to clean and fresh water. I'll give you a good example. Syria, everybody knows at least that people are dying in the thousands in Syria, correct? So originally that was just kind of attributed to some local rabble. Now you see intelligence reports that are saying that climate change, or that a drought, which was propagated by climate change, is actually the main source of the hostility in the region. Syria suffered about a 3 to 4 year drought, which affected 3 million farmers. So 3 million farmers had 90% or more of their crops of wheat affected. 1 million of those 3 million left their farms, they packed up their families, and they moved into the cities. They had no jobs, and their skill set was farming, and you really can't farm in an urban city. Wheat prices went through the roof, as you can expect, because no one's growing wheat. Syria supplies a lot of the wheat to the entire Arab region, so places like Libya and Egypt, they export a lot of their wheat. That wheat didn't grow anymore, and when you have a lot of people without food moving into cities, you can see these frictions start to rise up. So there's a lot of people that know what they're talking about in a lot of these agencies when it comes to national security that have very expressly written and stated that climate change is a threat to national security. Anyone else have anything on that?
How will climate change affect us domestically from a national security? Obviously, internationally, send our troops over there, sending aid over there, having past us, but what will happen within our borders?
So,
Predict
within our borders, that's a great question. So the sinking cities are one thing. We might be able to build seawalls to prevent that. I'd just like to say the reason that sea levels seem to flood Florida and New Orleans and some places, sea level is not one measurement, right? The sea is not one height all over. The earth spins, and a lot of physics and math that I can't do are involved. And the ocean is actually different heights at different places. It's not all one happy average. So some places are going to sink, and 40% of the people in the world live near the coast. Those people are going to have to move inland. So you'll see climate refugees. That's going to be around the world, anywhere people live near the coast. The drought effects in California are going to affect our national food shortages. That's also global, too. They export a lot of the food. As fresh water becomes more scarce, we're probably going to want to tap into the Great Lakes. We share those with Canada. They're probably also going to want that water, so we might develop a treaty with them. We might break that treaty because we can beat up Canada, so there's no, we can do it. You might actually see that border fence in Mexico get built as the southern equatorial regions get a lot hotter and people start migrating up to, because we're projected to be able to grow more food in the polar regions. As it gets warmer in the poles, where we can grow food is going to shift polarly as well. So as those people move up, we're probably not going to want them in here. So America and Canada actually stand to actually gain some fertility off of climate change. Yes, he's still got a...
I just want to say also the melting of the ice. That's visible. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah. You do have, countries also competing for who can drill in the ocean. So Russia's claimed the North Pole, Canada's claimed the North Pole, America's claimed the North Pole. We all claim the North Pole, and we all want the oil there. So that's also a source.
as an add-on, have there been any projections as to whether or not we may see another dust bowl in this country in the next decade?
You touched on NASA, correct? Yeah, so NASA's made projections that California is going to hit a mega drought, and you really can't determine if a dust bowl's going to occur, but we're going to lose a lot of plant roots that hold that topsoil together, so the conditions will certainly be fantastic. Yes. Anyone else? I saw a few hands. No? Okay. Sorry? No one?
Okay. Do you think developing alternative energy sustainably would contribute to world peace and stability in the Middle East?
Excuse me? Yeah, so he asked if renewable energies could lead to world peace, or more specifically, peace in the Middle East. Probably, actually, maybe. Saudi Arabia makes a lot of money off of oil. They also get a lot of sun, so there is the chance that as technology improves that they could harness their own solar energy. America actually outproduced Saudi Arabia in oil in 2013, I believe it was, since we own the North Pole now. We can drill underwater, and we have our own oil. So it's national politics. That's kind of tough to see where allegiances are going to lie. The Iran deal is in the works. Egypt is actually trying to head up its own Security Council and get a lot of the Middle Eastern countries together to form their own UN-style military response team so they can combat things like ISIS, so America will stop having a lot of involvement. So you never really know where those things are going to go or what's going to happen. And Dr. Stander was actually lived in Jordan, so...
I'm not going to talk about about that.
It's in the middle.
Well, one thing that I'd like to add, I think that's a great question, and a dynamic of that is that renewable energy is local, right? So if Saudi Arabia, for example, generates a lot of solar power, they can't really export that in a meaningful way. So I think renewable energy, in a sense, becomes an equalizer, in my viewpoint, and that people are making their energy where they actually use it, and it's no longer being transported these long distances. Will some other kind of resource become the next big oil? Perhaps. There's talk about water being something that gets transported and sold on world economic markets, and that could rearrange geopolitical alliances, and things could really change. It's hard to predict, as Greg said, but I think the neat thing about renewable energy is how local it is, and that also means that the jobs stay in those places, which is exciting.
Anyone else? All right, and we have one last question written down. So this is a hot topic. How do you suggest rectifying the current food crisis without the use of GMOs? Please.
So actually, a lot of recent studies are finding that GMOs are not as high yielding as like sustainable organic practices. But if you throw that argument out altogether, using current sustainable practices, a lot of success has been met recently with vertical farming, where they've had yields of over 25 times per square foot as much as the best case scenario yield of any GM or non-GM crop. On top of that, there are now new like hydroponic methods with direct nutrient input to the plant, so you have no soil loss or soil at all. There's no need for pesticides because there's no bugs. And the food is all more nutritious, so you'll need less of it, and it's also producing more at the same time. And this is easily implementable across the world.
Thank you. Yes?
With the GMOs, though, since if you take corn used to be like the size of my pinky, but over time, it was crossbred. So now each stalk of corn is probably like 25 times larger.
Right. Yeah, that.
If you're trying to not have GMOs, would that kind of reduce the amount of food?
That's actually not considered a GMO. It's like it's a process of natural selection. So humans have selected certain plants to continue breeding, and those plants in turn have become more and more fruitful naturally. This isn't with any gene splicing, or they're not adding like hippo genes to flowers to make them extra big. It's just nature.
Yeah, so some of the things on GMOs are the reason they genetically modify organisms. So we'll take a company, say a really evil company exists out there, and we'll just make one up. We'll call it Monsanto. And what they do is they genetically modify their food so that they can withstand the biocides, the herbicides and pesticides, things designed to kill life, and they make them resistant to that, right? So I'm actually in the middle on this. I don't think GMO, like the process of actually modifying the food hasn't proven to be anything terrible yet. It could also not. So like the gentleman said, humans have been modifying our food for a long time. We're just really good at it now. Like we can get in a lab and just pull out some genes and put some in there. The immediate danger really comes from when you start just spraying these things with Roundup, which kills all the life, which kills all the plants, runs into the river, destroys the water supply, ultimately ends up in the ocean. And Roundup's even linked to killing coral around the world. And Roundup is used very heavily around the world as well. So modifying the food doesn't seem to be the immediate problem. The immediate problem is the poisons that we're putting on that modified food. As the earth gets a lot hotter and it's harder to grow crops in the places we used to grow crops, I personally think we might need corn and tomatoes and wheat that can stand up to higher temperatures. If that proves that they can do that without giving me cancer, that would be fantastic. That's just my own opinion on it. Anyone have anything they'd like to say? Yes, sir.
I know Monsanto, but when the slide was up there that listed the other companies, I saw Dow,
Mm-hmm.
Our country and in the world we export. And I guess I'm just surprised to see those other names there.
Yeah, it's really.
Didn't know the full.
Yeah. Yeah, Europe operates on what they call the precautionary principle, and that is if it's a chemical and we don't know what it does, let's assume it's really bad until we prove it isn't. These fantastic companies have lobbied in America to make it so that if they can produce a chemical and we don't know it's bad, we can use it until we know it's bad. Their thought being, if this product gives everyone cancer, then why would I make it? Because I don't want people to have cancer. Whereas the EU says, send me some test results. I think that's a great way to do things. That's going to take a lot of citizen involvement and voting correctly.
How long has it been that way?
In this country, it's been that way in this country, since this country. Yes?
Yeah. On that same note, there are many, this is applicable to other things in this country too. One recent study shows that, like renewable bags, like biodegradable bags. So for the longest time we've been using them through different companies and different businesses use them. But recent research shows that renewable bags are actually not renewable at all. They're exactly the same as a regular plastic bag. It's just that a company or someone decided to say, oh, this is biorenewable. And no one checked up on that. And now companies notice that, oh, it's actually not biorenewable. So it's something that's a problem in our industry and in our business practices, and it's definitely something that needs to be resolved.
Thank you. All right, I am out of questions, but there's been some fantastic ones from the audience. So if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make, now's the time. Wow. That's better than a lot of governments are doing, for sure. All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, whether you chose to or were made to. It's been fantastic having you guys. Thank you very much, and thanks again to our panelists, to Dr. Stander, to Dr. Bodino.